Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making an heirloom hand chisel. Today I'll be making a couple of hand-forged chisels. Now, my son turned 21 this year, and so I decided to make him a set of tools and a toolbox. So this is part of that build. For more on the build, or to watch some of the other tool builds involved in it, check out the cards and descriptions for links to that playlist. By the way, I'll be working on a couple of different chisels as we go, so if you see a chisel suddenly change in size in the middle of the operation, that's why. I'll be forging these chisels from 01 tool steel. The first thing I'll do is to cut a shoulder into the bar. Now honestly, I was doing a video about collet holders when I was making this chisel, so I chose this technique entirely for demonstration purposes and not because I'd really do it this way. Normally I'd just forge the shoulder and then clean it up later. However you do it here, the issue is this. Once the chisel's assembled, I want a really flat mating surface, which is ultimately going to be here. And that's where the chisel is going to bear against the handle. So the flatter that is, the better that joint. I've put the stock into a 5C collet, which is attached to a hexagonal collet block. This allows me to put a stop on my vise that will index the stock to the exact same place as I rotate the block. Then I'll mill 6 little flats, which will connect to make a 360-degree flat surface all the way around the stock. If you're interested in finding out more about 5C collets, I've got a whole video on the subject, and I'll make a link to that in the cards and description. Now we get to the fun part, forging. I'll begin with the tang, which is the part that I've just prepared. All I'm doing is forging this little bulbous section here down to the level of the milled section, so I get a nice round tang. Pretty simple. The only thing to watch for here is that you don't want to just whack straight down, which would tend to cause cold shuts. In other words, places where the steel kind of folds over on itself. So I'll just hang it off the edge of the anvil. I'm just hammering on a little bit of a bias to flatten that corner back into the stock. After you've got that sorted out, then it's just basic elbow grease, rotating the stock and drawing it out until you get a nice round tang. I'll neck it down a little here. In this case, I'm using a guillotine type hardy tool, but you could do this easily enough on the horn of your anvil. Or you can skip it entirely. You don't have to have a neck on a chisel. Now I'll flip it around and forge a flat section for the body of the chisel itself. None of this is very advanced forging. If you're just getting into smithing, a chisel is a great beginner project. A few taps to form the bevel at the tip, and we're done. The final step here is to normalize the steel, a step intended to reduce the grain structure of the steel as well as to remove stresses formed by forging. I'll do that by heating it to roughly 1600 degrees and then cooling it to a black heat. Each time you repeat the process, the grain gets smaller, which makes the steel more resilient. So I'm actually doing this normalization step 3 times. Now I'll take the chisel over to the belt grinder and clean it up. If you're making one and you don't have a good belt grinder, you can use a file, an angle grinder, a bench grinder, or any number of other approaches to bring it to the final shape. If you use a file, however, I'd recommend using a really old crappy file because, believe it or not, the scale, that's the black stuff that forms on the steel when it's forged, is substantially harder than your file and will wear it out pretty quickly. If you sort of cut with the corners of the file, that'll rip off most of that scale, and then you can turn to a new, fresh, sharp file and flatten it all out. Incidentally, I'm not bringing the file tip to a sharp edge. I'll limit my grinding to about a 32nd of an inch, roughly a millimeter, and then stop there on that edge. The reason for this comes in the next step, heat treating. In this step, we'll fire up the forge again and harden the steel. Right now the steel is very soft and won't make for a useful edge tool, so we have to quench the blade, causing the steel's molecular structure to convert to a harder form of steel known as martensite. As I'm heating the steel here, if the edge is completely sharp, two bad things can happen. One is that it's very easy to overheat, making it more likely to crack. But also, when steel is heated, carbon migrates slowly out of the exposed steel, softening it. In a relatively quick process like we're doing here, there's not a ton of decarburization, but it's still something that I'm always aware of when I'm heating up edge tools. I'm aiming to reach about 1500 degrees and then quench. Steel becomes non-magnetic at 425, so once it hits that mark, I know I'm close. Just a little more time in the forge. Then I'll plunge the chisel into some oil. Some steels can be quenched simply by cooling in air, some have to be cooled in water, but O1 is an oil quenching steel. I'm using engineered quenching oil here, but if you're doing this in your shop, warm peanut oil will work just fine. Then temper them to soften them up a little bit and make them more resilient. Now it's back to the grinder to clean everything up. Let's turn to the handle. I'll be making mine on my lathe. No lathe, you can just drill a handle for the tang in a small block of wood and then carve or sand it to shape, so that's not a barrier. Now, I'm no lathe expert, but turning a handle is really not the most advanced thing you can do on a lathe. I'm using an old piece of flame wood here. I'm not sure you can even get this stuff anymore. It may be banned for import, I'm not sure. Anyway, once it's shaped, I'll sand it. Then apply some beeswax. And I'm done. Now I'll drill a hole in the handle on my drill press. And we're ready to assemble. You always want to test fit this sort of thing. In this case, I needed to do a little cleanup with files to get everything to fit flush. The more you can get that nice flush joint at the tang, the more even that the stress on the handle will be, and therefore the less likely it is to split under load. Dead simple work here. Mix some epoxy, slather it in there, jam it into the handle. And that's about it. I sharpened it off camera, but there's nothing special about that process. People really fetishize wood tool sharpening, but in this case, I just sharpened it with a belt grinder and then honed the final edge on a 1200 grit diamond stone. Plenty sharp for most normal cabinetry work. Properly maintained, this chisel will be good for decades of use. Making tools for people you care about is always intensely satisfying. I'm really proud of my son, and I hope he gets many years of use out of these tools. I hope you enjoyed seeing this tool made. Like I said up top, this is part of a series of videos that I made about tools for my son's birthday. Catch more of the videos on the playlist. Link in the cards and descriptions. Thanks for tagging along, and see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.